Welcome to our introduction to the city-state of Athens, the polis of Athens. First, we're going to look at the mythological history of the city-state of Athens, its early kings and early forms of government. Next, we're going to turn to the figure of Solon and his attempts to reform these forms of government, the traditional aristocratic system that had grown up in the Archaic period. Solon creates the conditions for the rise of Athenian democracy. Finally, we're going to turn to the tyranny of Peisistratus. In Athens, the Archaic period culminated in the tyranny of the figure of Peisistratus, and then the assassination of his child Hipparchus by two Athenians, the tyrannicides Harmodius and Aristogeiton. This event ushered in the age of Cleisthenes, the reforms of Cleisthenes, and Athenian democracy as we know it in the 5th century. Now in Athens, the worship of the patron god Athena took place at the center of the city, the Acropolis. The process of synoicism, the coming together, early in the city's history, around the 8th century BCE, unified the disparate population centers of the countryside of Attica into one city-state, the city-state of Athens. This event is attributed historically, mythologically, to the mythological figure of Theseus, and it's called the Unification of Attica. The Iliad actually mentions Athens, and it's our earliest written history in the catalog of ships. And also, simultaneously, there are Mycenaean remains of a citadel on the Acropolis. So there is some evidence for continuity between the Bronze Age, the Archaic Age, and the Classical period in Athens. And this is not something that people can say usually, but every place in ancient Greece. Now, the king list of Athens is not very historically accurate. We are relying on sources incredibly far removed from the time period that it's describing, but it usually includes 15 kings. The most important of these 15 are Keycrops, Erectius, and Erichthonius. All three of them have mythological and historical elements. Keycrops was a mythical king of Athens. He's usually not the first king, but later Athenians clearly regard him as sort of their archetypal, emotional ancestral figure. For example, we have no parents recorded for Keycrops, which generally gives you the idea that he was the first of something. And also he was thought of, and this is connected, as being autochthonous. This is an important term, especially in the ideology and propaganda of Athens, and it means emerged natively from the ground, with no outside influence, colonial travel, or parentage. In other words, the ground is your mother. You emerged directly from the ground with no outside influences. So autochthonous means emerging from the earth natively. The normal style of Keycrops' depiction on, for example, red figure vases was as a half-man, half-snake figure. His daughters were also important in myth: Aglaurus, Pandrosus, and Hirce. Now Erichthonius was also an Athenian hero and king connected with the Acropolis and its cults. It's very possible that he originally was identical with the figure of Erectius that we'll meet in a second, and this is a cause of confusion for many students of ancient Greece. Unlike Erectius, Erichthonius has very specific myths concerning his birth and his infancy, and these are also caught up with ideas of autochthony. According to the myth most commonly told about his birth, the smith god Hephaestus attempted to rape Athena, but only succeeded in spilling his semen on her thigh. She wiped it off with a piece of wool, in Greek this is erinon, and dropped it on the ground, whereupon the earth gave birth to Erichthonius, that is, autochthonously. After his birth, Earth handed him over to Athena for rearing. Remember that Athena has to be a virgin goddess, so this is caught up in all kinds of ideas about the role of Athena in Athens, the role of the Earth as far as giving forth autochthonous beings, and the concept of autochthony in general. Later, Athena actually put Erichthonius in a basket and entrusted him to the daughters of Keycrops, who, with disastrous results, disobeyed her instructions not to look inside. These myths relate to a pair of rituals performed on the Acropolis, the Apaturia and a Panathenaea. Now, Erectius is in some ways the most normative of this triad of figures. Erectius was a figure sometimes identified with the god Poseidon, but often he was regarded as simply an early king of Athens, just like Erichthonius and Keycrops. Usually he's the grandson of Erichthonius. In Book 2 of the Iliad, the Iliadic catalog of ships which we mentioned, we actually hear from Homer of an Erectius who was born from Earth and brought up by Athena, living in her sanctuary on the Acropolis. The most common event or tradition involving Erectius, the king, was his war against Eleusis, where the city-state of Eleusis was annexed by Athenians, and the Athenians gained control of the mysteries of Eleusis. Erectius actually won by killing the enemy leader Eumolpus, a son of Poseidon. but was thereupon himself killed by a blow of Poseidon's trident. Now we come to the famous figure of Theseus. Theseus' father was Aegeus, the son of Pandion, another king of Athens in this list of kings. Theseus' mother was Aithra of Troezen, a nearby city. According to myth, Theseus was fated to travel to Athens and become a famous king, although it's not entirely clear how this relates to his father's. There might have been something problematic about Aegeus' status as king of Athens. Once Theseus was king of Athens, however, his most famous exploit was the killing of the Minotaur on Crete. In revenge for the death of his son, King Minos had laid upon Athens an annual tribute of 7 youths and 7 maidens to be given to the Minotaur as a sacrifice. Theseus traveled to Crete in disguise as one of these youths and killed the Minotaur with the help of Minos' daughter, Ariadne. Theseus' sons and descendants ruled Athens for a number of years. Another important event in the early history of Athens is the Ionian Migration. The Ionian Migration revolves around another Athenian king, King Codrus. King Codrus was a member of the family of Neleus, and the story goes that he came to Attica when actually expelled from Pylos by the arrival of the Dorians and the sons of Heracles. Upon his arrival, after killing the Boeotian king Xanthus in single combat during a frontier war, he was accepted as king of the Athenians in place of the reigning descendant of Theseus. Now, according to tradition, the western coast of Turkey, Ionia, was colonized by refugees from the Greek mainland, flying before the Dorians and other tribes from northwest Greece. In other words, it's connected to the story of Codrus. According to Herodotus, Ionians are all those who derive from Athens and celebrate a certain festival called the Apaturia. According to these same traditions, it was the sons of Codrus, and in particular Neleus, who led the colonization of Ionia from Athens. It's extremely unclear whether the tradition that Codrus from Pylos actually colonized Ionia after he went to Athens is rooted in historical fact or actually was invented as some sort of imperialistic fiction by the 5th century Athenians who gained much influence and power in the classical period. Now, important elements of the functioning of the government of Archaic Athens is tied up in the tribal system, which does have links to the Ionians of Codrus. Herodotus tells us that all Ionians celebrate the festival called the Apaturia, except a pair of cities called Ephesus and Colophon. It was associated with a particular social grouping called the phratry. A phratry was functionally just a group with hereditary membership and was probably associated with specific localities. Just a general group that means clan. It's a good translation would be clan. The main focus of the Apaturia was to enroll new members in this clan or phratry, who, by this registration, acquired the right of citizenship in Athens or whatever polis they were connected to, whatever Ionian polis. At the Apaturia, animals are sacrificed to Zeus Fratrios and Athena Fratria. In Archaic Athens, there were 4 tribes, or phylae, which were divided among these phratries. Parallel to this were the aristocratic families, or genae. The eupatridae, or nobles, were one of these genae. Here are a couple key dates in the development of Athens, which we're going to touch on individually as we go on. At around 620 BCE, Dracos Laws on homicide were put into practice and promulgated. In 594 BCE, Solon was appointed archon at Athens, and he drafted laws to relieve economic and political tensions that had grown up in Athens. In 561 BC, the tyranny of Peisistratus begins. In 510 BCE, the rule of Hippias ends, ending the reign of the Peisistratid family. Now, Dracos Laws were put into effect around 620 BCE, the latter part of the 7th century. This was the first time that Athenian laws were actually put in writing. Perhaps it was drawn up in the wake of Solon's attempt at tyranny, which is around the middle of the 7th century. It has been interpreted also as perhaps an attempt to prevent the growing up and the spreading of blood feuds. Recall that families had traditionally taken justice into their own hands when it came to murders, and Dracos Laws transferred the power to the state to administer justice in the cases of murders. In order for these systems to work, everybody has to agree that they're fair and equitable for all parties concerned. During this period, enslavement of the poor for debt burden continued, and this led to the need for Solon's reforms. Solon was one of the 7 sages of Archaic Greece. He was a wise man, a lawgiver, and a poet. The son of a certain Echecestides, who was a descendant of the Codrid clan of Athens, although this piece of evidence is a little tenuous. By tradition, he was of high birth and middling wealth and station. Solon campaigned effectively on behalf of the poor residents of Athens, and he made a series of promises about the reforms he intended. These promises were put up on wooden posts called axones, which are believed to contain the public showing of Solon's laws and were posted publicly in Athens. At around the 590s, when Solon enters the scene at Athens, the poor were suffering from debt slavery due to the poor access to land. And actually the quality of the land itself was very poor. Simultaneously to this dynamic, a new class of rich trading magnates was emerging, and this class was shut out from political power and prestige. They wanted access to magistracies and the power that came with the aristocracy. In 594, Solon was empowered to draw up laws as an elected archon, the highest magistrate, and he enacted the Seisachtheia, which in Greek means the shaking off of burdens. This act served to abolish debt slavery among the poor. This means that the individual's bodies or person could not be held as collateral if they couldn't pay their debt. The Seisachtheia is represented in our sources as a liberation of a group of people called the Hectomoroi, which translates literally to sixth parters. It's not entirely clear who these people were or why they were called sixth parters, but most likely they were men in a state of servitude who had to give a sixth of their produce to the overlord who owned their product, who owned their work. It was apparently through Solon that their obligation was abolished, and they became the absolute owners of the land that they worked. Men who had been enslaved for debt, many of them perhaps hectomoroi who had defaulted on their obligation, were freed, and in the future, enslavement for debt was banned. We also have evidence for reforms in the realm of grants of citizenship to immigrant craftsmen, a ban on the export of agricultural products other than olive oil. This perhaps encouraged Athens to develop into a trading economy. Solon's sumptuary laws are very famous also. They restricted the display of wealth among aristocrats, especially in funereal events. So there was no fancy mausoleums to build or funeral processions with images of the ancestors as in Rome. This was to create social cohesion among the Athenians. Solon's reforms also gave privileges to the new wealthy. Functionally and crucially, political privilege was now based on wealth, not on birth in the Solonian system. Solon instituted 4 new census classes. The term census comes from Rome. Solon restructured political privilege according to wealth instead of birth. His 4 classes were based on how much money you had. That's where the census comes in. You would count how much money each person had. 500 bushel men was the highest class. They could hold all civic offices in the city. Hippes, or the horsemen, or the knights, were the second class. They were eligible for all offices but treasurer. The zeugatai, the yokemen, were eligible for all but the treasurer, and also the archon. They were ineligible for the archonship. These zeugatai could afford hoplite arms and made up the majority of the hoplite force. Now the thetes, the thetes, were the poor farmers. They were landless and could only partake in the assembly, the ecclesia, and the law courts, the eleia. They couldn't afford hoplite arms, but could serve as light armed troops and rowers in the fleet, and were later to become crucial to the functioning of the Athenian Empire. This system created not necessarily a democracy, but a quasi-merit or wealth-based government. Political prestige was now determined by wealth and not by birth. This is a significant upgrade. The reforms reduced tension between aristocrats and the newly wealthy class battling for political power. Mechanically, Solon created a council of 400 to run Athens. The council consisted of 100 men elected from each of the 4 Athenian tribes. The creation of this council broadened political opportunity for wealthy Athenians who didn't belong to the old aristocratic families. The Council of 400 prepared business to put before the full assembly, the ecclesia, and functioned as a counterweight to the aristocratic power of the Areopagus Council, which had existed before Solon. The Areopagus Council was an aristocratic advisory body that traditionally chose the archons and was made up of archons. It was considered the guardian of the laws, the protector of traditional custom and morality. Most of our information comes from after Solon, but in the 500s it at least possessed full power to impose fines, punishments in certain kinds of cases, especially those concerning murder and inheritance. Under Solon, the archons were still the main magistrate of Athens, the highest magistrate office, but they were elected by the ecclesia. There were 9 total archons in the 6th century, and Solon may have included an element of allotment in his reform of their appointment. This was to improve the chances of candidates who were rich but not noble. When the term of the office was done, the archons joined the Areopagus Council for life. It's important to note that the Areopagus was always and still remained a council with an aristocratic leaning. Solon counterbalanced this body with his new governing council or boule of 400. Solon also enacted judicial reform to protect poorer citizens. Citizens now all had the right of appeal versus decisions of the magistrates in a people's court. Any citizen could seek redress, file a suit on behalf of one another, and importantly, magistrates could now be tried for misconduct after the term of their office. Solon, of course, is also a poet. He shows in his poems that he was trying to forge a compromise between the demands of the rich and the needs of the poor. Future events in Athens, of course, including the rule of Peisistratus, shows us that he probably did not achieve all of his aims. There was not the total redistribution of land which some probably had wanted, but the deprived landlords or overlords thought there was probably too much change. Of course, the caste of old nobility was reluctant to share political power with the newly rich and non-nobles of the governing class. After his reforms, Solon is said to have spent the next 10 years in overseas travel, during which his measures were not to be altered. It is possible that he here met Amasis of Egypt, but if he died at around 560 BCE, as it is thought, it is unlikely that he met the famous Croesus of Lydia and had his famous discussion about the meaning of life. The story goes in Herodotus that Croesus had considered himself to be the happiest man alive, and Solon had advised him, "Count no man happy until he is dead." Famously, it was only after Croesus had lost his kingdom to the Persian king Cyrus that the Lydian acknowledged the wisdom of the Athenian Solon's advice. While awaiting execution, Croesus exclaimed that Solon had been right all along. The next famous figure we meet in our history of Athens is Peisistratus. Peisistratus was a tyrant of Athens. He claimed descent from Neleus of Pylos like Codrus and his namesake Peisistratus, who is mentioned in the Odyssey. He first came to prominence through his successful prosecution of the Athenian war against Megara in the middle of the 6th century. At the time, there was a serious conflict between two aristocratic factions. On the one side, we had Lycurgus and the Pediaes, the party of the plain, and on the other side, we have Megacles and the Paralioi, that is, people of the coast. Megacles is a member of the Alcmaeonid clan, who we'll meet later. Now, Peisistratus created a third faction, the Hyperacreioi, or the Diacrioi, referring to the hill country, most often thought to be in northeast Attica, which is where Peisistratus is from. The three factions reflected a regional basis of power in Attica. At around 560 BCE, Peisistratus first seized power in Athens with actually a bodyguard granted him by the Demos. Subsequently ousted by the other two factions, he returned again, this time with an alliance with the Alcmaeonid Megacles, and took power again. However, the alliance with Megacles disintegrated, and Peisistratus was ejected from Athens and went into a 10-year exile. Our evidence suggests that he traveled to Macedonia, and from then to Eretria and Euboea. Armed with money and mercenaries, Peisistratus defeated his opposition at the Battle of Pallene in 546, and his tyranny lasted for 36 years. Some sources tell us that Peisistratus' rule was actually benevolent and law-abiding, and it was during his rule, from the middle of the 6th century onwards, that Athens began to acquire its monumental appearance: temples, roads, and civic buildings. It became a pan-Hellenic artistic and cultural center under Peisistratus. The tyrant has historically been credited with the establishing of the festival of the Panathenaea, which is fundamental to the identity of the Athenians. It was certainly reorganized in 566. Whether he created it is another matter. He re-sanctified and purified the special Ionian center of Delos and instituted a festival there that had been dormant for centuries. It has been persuasively argued that the current state of our Homeric hymn to Apollo actually reflects this historic event. Peisistratus died in 537, and the rule fell to his son, Hippias. Now, Hippias, alongside his younger brother Hipparchus, ruled Athens from 527 to 510. Both Hippias and Hipparchus were later remembered as patrons of the arts, just like their father. Plato tells us that Hipparchus introduced the texts of Homer to Athens and instituted the performance of the Iliad and the Odyssey at the Panathenaea that his father had reorganized. Hipparchus invited the poets Anacreon and Simonides to Athens. The brothers were probably also responsible for the famous image of the owl on Athenian coinage, as well as the building of the temple of Olympian Zeus, which is called Olympeion. The main enemies of the Peisistratids were the Alcmaeonidae. The Alcmaeonidae were a famous aristocratic genos, that is a family, the plural would be gene, who lived in Athens. The Alcmaeonidae claimed descent from the mythological Alcmaeon, the great-grandson of Nestor. Their famous forebears were legion and usually named Megacles. In 630 BCE, an Alcmaeonid Megacles had famously killed the tyrant Solon, who was supplicating the statue of Athena and thus was cursed, and this curse would come back to bite his ancestors. Another Alcmaeonid Megacles had been the elder Peisistratus' rival in his first coup. Now the story goes that around 514 BCE, backed by these Alcmaeonids, Hippias' brother Hipparchus was assassinated by two Athenians named Harmodius and Aristogeiton. The backstory is that apparently Hipparchus had come on to Harmodius, who refused, and in response, because he had been spurned, Hipparchus retaliated by removing Harmodius' sister from the prestigious role as a basket carrier at the Canophoria. Hipparchus is killed at the celebration of the Panathenaea, and Hippias barely regains control. After their failure to overthrow the tyrant, the Alcmaeonidae were exiled from Athens. Now the first temple at Delphi had been destroyed by fire, and the contract to rebuild it was actually purchased by members of this Athenian Alcmaeonidae in the middle of the 6th century, about 20 years before. The temple building contract actually specified the use of poros, or soft stone, but the Alcmaeonidae ended up using expensive, fine-grained Parian marble for the east facade. This was their play to get power and influence at Delphi. So unable to affect Athenian policy directly, the Alcmaeonids now ended up using their influence at Delphi, that is, they functionally bribed the oracle, to incite the Spartans to overthrow Peisistratus and install a new government. This is in fact what happened. The king Cleomenes came and ejected the Peisistratids, and this new government would eventually become the democracy of Athens in the 5th century. And that's where we'll pick up next time. Thanks a lot, guys.